Hello, today we'll be analyzing the central question of analyze the impact of guerrilla warfare on the course and outcome of two 20th century wars. The two wars that will be studied are the Chinese Civil War in 1920 and the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. The thesis is, in both conflicts, guerrilla warfare was used socially in order to gain the support of the population. In terms of outcome, the use of guerrilla warfare facilitated this transition of both governments following the conflict as they had gained the support from the population. However, the use of guerrilla warfare was a decisive factor in the final battle of the Cuban Revolution, the Battle of Santa Clara, as opposed to the Chinese Hua Hei campaign that converged the guerrilla armies into a conventional one. First, let's define guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a type of warfare fought by irregulars and fast-moving, small-scale actions against orthodox military and police forces, and on occasion against rival insurgent forces, either independently or in conjunction with a larger political military strategy. This type of warfare relies on hit-and-run tactics by highly mobile, lightly to moderately armed units that feature deception, speed, and flexibility. Usually, these guerrilla warfare is conducted by indigenous anti-government forces and not the regular armed forces of a state. Its characteristic attacks include ambush, raids, sabotage, and blocking of enemy lines of communication. Here is a brief overview of the conflicts that are going to be studied. The Chinese Civil War spanned from 1927 to 1950, and it primarily stemmed from a clash in ideologies between the two prevalent political parties at the time, the Kuomintang (KMT) and the Chinese Communist Party. The leader of the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, attacked the Communist Party in 1927 when the United Front Alliance, the combined forces of the Communists and the Nationalists, had reached its goal of defeating the warlords in China. Chiang's primary goal was to crush the KMT's or nationalist enemy, communism, and began to persecute the communists. Just as Chiang sought to annihilate communism, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, also desired to attack the KMT because Mao fought for the ideal universal justice. During the fight, Mao was able to win the war through his use of guerrilla warfare as a social movement, and we will talk more in depth about Mao's strategy in the following slides.
The second war that we will address today is the Cuban Revolution. We will focus on two specific events later on in the presentation. The President Fulgencio Batista seized the martial dictatorship in Cuba. Under his rule, the Cuban people lived in a corrupt world with over-dependence on a single crop, political and economic subordination to the United States, and poverty and inequality. In addition, under his rule, the distinction between rich and the poor became more blatant. On one end, one had the 1.5 million who were jobless or who belonged to the rural poor. On the other hand, one had the 900,000 wealthiest Cubans who controlled 43% of the country's income. This wide gap led to Fidel Castro to lead the anti-Batista movement known as the July 26th movement. Following the defeat of the Battle of Santa Clara, Batista surrendered and fled Cuba, leaving Castro as the new leader of Cuba in 1959.
Now, let's examine the use of guerrilla warfare and their impact on the course and effects of the two wars. Both Mao and Fidel Castro relied on the use of peasants in order to conduct their social movements. In addition, they used the same tactics of guerrilla warfare, such as attacking the enemy by surprise, using small forces, and especially mobility. Both leaders made the use of propaganda and the media to gather support for their respective causes. Mao used his 8 points of attention in order to show the sharp contrast between the dishonest nationalists and the upright communists. Castro used pirate radio broadcasts, public displays, and interviews with journalists as propaganda to plead his case and make his military force appear mightier than it actually was.
The use of guerrilla warfare was also evidently different in both wars in terms of mobilization and destruction. The evident use of guerrilla warfare in the Chinese Civil War impacted the course of the war by helping the CCP to win through the casualties they were able to cause on a superiorly equipped army and a quick spread of Mao's ideologies and authoritarian rule through the peasant soldiers. Although the Communist Red Army was not successful in any of these battles, the Nanchang Uprising, aftermath of the Autumn Harvest Uprising, and Long March of the Chinese Civil War showed traces of the development and use of guerrilla warfare tactics by the Communist Party. Mao had his own ideology and attitude towards guerrilla warfare that he wrote about in his own piece on guerrilla warfare in 1937. Mao had 7 fundamental steps toward his policy that he employed during the CCW. He believed in arousing and organizing the people, achieving internal unification politically, establishing bases, equipping forces, recovering national strength, destroying enemies' national strength, and regaining lost territories. Some of these fundamentals, such as achieving internal unification and arousing and organizing the people, were emphasized and developed following the Nanchang and Autumn Harvest Uprising. This was emphasized when the troops under Zhu Di and Chen Yi, remaining from the Nanchang Uprising, joined forces with Mao's troops from the Autumn Harvest Uprising, meeting at the border of the Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. In all, the army was made up of 10,000 troops of united peasants and workers in April 1928. In addition, another piece of Mao's ideology relevant in the book he wrote on his own idea of guerrilla warfare, "There is no profound difference between the farmer and the soldier," was evident throughout that unification. Mao believed in recruiting the peasants to fight because he thought everyone was equally capable in terms of military capability. Lastly, for the CCW, both the Nanchang Uprising and Long March helped to show Mao's idea: when the enemy advances, we retreat. During the Long March, the quick retreat developed into guerrilla tactics. On October 16, 1934, when the Communists were losing a fight and broke out of the encirclement at its weakest points and fled, over 80,000 troops fled to the countryside mountain, and the march ended 4 days and 4,000 miles later with just 8,000 troops surviving. A similar retreat occurred in the Nanchang Uprising on August 1, 1927. After 3 disastrous days, the survivors of the Red Army ultimately fled, also showing the guerrilla ideology of retreat. Therefore, the Nanchang Uprising and Long March, guerrilla tactics such as quick mobile retreat and national unification, were 2 elements that, despite defeat in these particular cases, led the peasant army to win over a better equipped opponent.
In the Cuban Revolution, Cuban guerrillas heavily relied on the countryside when attacking an enemy. This is seen in battles such as the July 26 movement of 1953. To give a brief summary, Fidel Castro and his guerrilla forces launched an attack on a remote outpost in the Moncada barracks. He expected that Batista's forces would be surprised by the attack. However, this attack failed, and Batista was able to push Fidel Castro's forces back. In military terms, the movement was a failure, but it ultimately symbolized the beginning of a complete break of Cuba's past. The Moncada barracks was located in the Sierra Maestra mountainside. The guerrillas used the advantage of being in the mountainside to take Batista's troops by surprise. The reliance of the specific setting and environment made guerrilla warfare in the Cuban Revolution unique to that of the Chinese Civil War. Che Guevara, a guerrilla leader in the Cuban Revolution, used the FOCO theory, the theory that a small group of dedicated guerrilla fighters could set off a mass uprising through spectacular acts, and that peasant uprising was the key to revolution in Latin America as a basis of Cuban guerrilla warfare. The FOCO theory was created after the Battle of Santa Clara. This was a series of events in 1958 which led to the capture of Cuban city Santa Clara and was led by Che Guevara. Che Guevara and his generals and his guerrillas captured one of Batista's armored trains consisting of a vast amount of weaponry and a basis of further attack in the hands of both the rebels and supported peasants. The capture of the train and the subsequent media broadcasts from both the government and the rebels proved to be a key tipping point in the revolution. The use of the guerrilla strategy ultimately resulted in the decisive victory for the rebels fighting against Batista. The use of guerrilla warfare also impacted the outcome of the 2 respective wars, as both Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro were able to gather support for their new policies. Through the use of propaganda during the fighting, Mao was able to appeal to the peasants in China, who made up the large majority of the population. He was able to initiate his Great Leap Forward policy in 1958 in order to rapidly and simultaneously develop agriculture and industry in the country. Despite the policy being a failure, as the Great Famine occurred, Mao was able to find support for his policies through the use of guerrilla warfare. By presenting the communists in a positive light with the 8 points of attention, the peasants supported Mao and his policies in a similar way. Fidel Castro was able to gain the support of the people and employ his policies. He implemented far-reaching reforms by nationalizing factories and plantations in an attempt to end U.S. economic dominance on the island.
This action was seen as a sign of communism affiliation to the Americans, and it pushed the Cubans closer to the Soviet Union, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In addition, Castro signed the first agrarian reform law, which limited the size of land holdings and forbade foreign property ownership. The intent was to develop a class of independent farmers, when in reality, this program led to state land control. During these both outcomes of the conflicts, the social use of guerrilla warfare allowed both of the key leaders to gain support for their policies and successfully enact them despite the devastating outcomes.
A contrast between the impact of guerrilla warfare on the outcome of the two respective wars is that during the decisive battles, guerrilla warfare had a more dramatic impact on the final battle of the Cuban Revolution than the Chinese Civil War's final campaign. The Chinese communists were able to win the war by shifting over from guerrilla warfare to positional warfare and an offensive toward the big cities. The decisive Huaihai campaign was one of the few conventional battles of the war. The Kuomintang forces consisted of 5 armies, and the army of the communists consisted of a force of more than 600,000 strong, which included 16 columns from the Eastern China Field Army, 7 columns from the Central Plains Field Army, and regional armed forces from the Eastern China Military Area, the Central Plains Military Area, and the Hoping Shandong Honan Military Area. This campaign destroyed nationalist power north of the Yangtze River and triggered Chiang Kai-shek's resignation as President of the Republic of China. This specific campaign did not utilize guerrilla warfare, but was rather a demonstration of encirclement and tactical destruction in detail of enemy forces by the attacking force. Communist forces had shifted to conventional warfare and had seized the operational and tactical initiative from the Nationalist Army. A key component in this campaign was the mobilization of hundreds of peasants who provided resources for the Communist Army. This key support was obtained due to Mao's use of guerrilla warfare as a social movement because he was able to appeal to the peasant population and gain their support. On the other hand, guerrilla warfare played a key strategic component during the final battle of the conflict, the Battle of Santa Clara. During the Battle of Santa Clara, it is stated that the campaign consisted of a guerrilla group ambushing a train and a series of street fights and sieges of buildings in which small contingents of Batista soldiers were holed up. The main position of the army, the Lonceo barracks, was still holding out when news arrived that the dictator had fled the country upon realizing his disadvantage. In this battle, guerrilla warfare was the tactic that the Cuban army followed, and it allowed them to overthrow Batista's army, causing Batista to flee. It is evident that guerrilla warfare impacted both of the conflict's final battles. However, guerrilla warfare played a more significant role during the Cuban Revolution than the Chinese Civil War. The Cuban Revolution rebels used guerrilla warfare throughout the whole conflict, whereas during the final campaign of the Chinese Civil War, the guerrilla armies were combined to follow conventional war tactics and defeat the nationalist army.
To conclude, it is clear that guerrilla warfare was a movement in both the Cuban Revolution and the Chinese Civil War for the purpose of gaining support of a population.